The new Void Dragon Catan, is a masterfully crafted miniature. It always amazes me how they get this complex sculpt cut up and arranged into a single sprue and in a way that people can actually build that thing. Now, while I get that Games Workshop wants to push the envelope and create more and more complex minis, I think you can still have aesthetically pleasing and compelling models without too much mumbo jumbo. So let me show you how I converted and painted my version of the Void Dragon. I started by cleaning all of the base elements, and I tried to get a feeling for how they would fit together and how I could arrange them to my needs. I then cut out all the elements that had stone on them, and except for this one that integrates with the hand of the model, I also got rid of most of the lightning effects. I wanted to have more options for my base design, and for that I needed a few extra pieces of the stone and base elements and decided to make casts of the plastic parts I just cut out. For that purpose, I used some instant sil blue, also known as, please forgive my pronunciation, Oyumaru, which comes in these blue strips, and it's a thermoplastic silicone, which means it gets soft when you put it into boiling water, and hardens again when it cools off. After I prepared a bunch of it, I pressed part of it flat on a cutting mat. You want to be careful with the hot water and not use your fingers to take it out, so I used pliers. I then pressed in the pieces I wanted to duplicate and created the first half of a two-part mold. You want to put them halfway in and press some of the material against the sides of the parts in order to reduce extra flash parts forming. I put in some holes in order to be able to find the right position for the second part of the mold. When the first half was dry, added the second half of the mold. Once both halves were dry, I took it apart and filled it with milliput and pressed it together. I got the best results by putting a heavier object on top. With a bit of experimentation and care while creating your molds, you can reduce the flash significantly and create really accurate copies. I mean, just look at the detail of the skull on this part. You can even see the separation of the teeth here. I cut up some of the parts I duplicated and started to think of a composition for my figure. I usually have a rough idea, like here I wanted the mini to float offset to the right, roughly at the golden ratio of the base, and then just rearrange the elements of the base to see what complements the pose and what doesn't. Once I was set on a rough plan, I glued everything together with superglue. And whenever I needed some bulk, I just added some layers of cork. I wanted my Void Dragon to float, but I needed to make sure it had just enough contact with the base so it would support itself and not crumble at the slightest bump. So I fixed one of the extra tiles to the base in a way that one foot would fit right on it and the tail still having enough space. I also made sure the tail was interacting with the base so I would have another point of contact and extra support. The only thing left to do was to build the part of the hand that would send out energy to interact with the ruined Necron structures, and for that I just checked what tiles would fit together in a slight arch and just glued them together. All the way up to where the lightning from the hands interacts with one of the rubble pieces already. Remember, that was the part where I kept the lightning intact in the beginning. I'm using super glue for all of this because I can use the activator spray to make the glue harden instantly, which helps a lot with this kind of kit bashing. And this is the result of the conversion. The general idea of the sculptor, which I want to say was Darren Latham, is still intact, but it's a lot less busy. Now let's continue with the paint job. The way the model was sculpted with a lot of these hard edges and separated muscle groups almost was begging for a sky-earth non-metallic metal effect, but instead I chose to see if I can make a simple metallic pattern work. I used Vallejo metal airbrush colors gold because it gives a really smooth surface that isn't too grainy. I decided to work with the natural reflection patterns and also decided not to add any highlights to the metals of the skin. Instead I went on to shade the deeper areas with Incubi darkness. I varied my layer thickness and sometimes I used layering, especially on these surfaces in the shadows, and sometimes I used a number of thinner glazes to create transitions between the shiny parts and the dull areas, like on the front of the upper leg. I took some inspiration from non-metallic metal patterns and defined the muscle parts accordingly. Remember, we can also build contrast by having reflective and non-reflective areas next to each other. I painted most of this model the same way, just gradually stacking layers of color on top of each other and creating a gradient this way. Once everything was defined in a satisfying way, I continued to shade the extremities with a mix of black Templar contrast paint and black. I wanted an overall gritty feeling and the dark extremities to contrast against the bright metallic core of the Mini. I tried to make the metal look as eerie and strange as possible, and to make it look like coal or some weird unknown material in some parts was just another way to do that. I applied a layer of thinned down Arial yellow to the head extension. I don't have that filmed for some reason, but you can see that the gold in the area is a lot more yellow than the gold on the body. I continued to shade the gold with Mournfang brown, and I think that created some nice contrast and also an interesting color variation. I based the wings and the spear in Vallejo metal colors dark aluminium, and I gave the metals a couple of washes with black Templar contrast paint. This color is pretty amazing because it has a blue tint to it, which will make for an interesting interaction with the orange brown I want to introduce to these parts later. I applied a few layers and made sure the elements were shaded towards the top. On the brighter parts, I used a couple of layers of transparent burnt sienna ink, and now you can see the interaction that is basically an orange and teal contrast, which is always very appealing to the eye. After defining the blade of the spear, I added a layer of ice yellow to all the parts I wanted to consist of energy. Like this part on the spear, the lightning part and the shard in his chest, as well as the symbol on his head and most of the energy veins on the Necron structures on the base. And all of the areas between the wings. I knew I wanted to work with fluid paints again, but I also wanted a very warm feel to the energy. That's why I started to shade these parts with thin layers of Arial yellow and made sure that I had a variety of darker and brighter parts. Next I took Scale Colors Red Ecstasy fluid paint and also applied thin layers and focused on the darker parts of the energy. This took a couple of layers, but I really dig the interaction of the fluid red and the brighter yellow highlights. That symbol on his head ended up standing out, and I do get a feeling of energy radiating out from it, even without an OSL effect, which is exactly the effect I was looking for. I continued to gradually build the gradients on all of the energy parts using the red ecstasy, and as I did that I tried to keep some of the brighter parts. It's quite difficult to create a light effect on energy without the use of ambient light and OSL, because you cannot make the elements bright and color intense with a high chroma at the same time. So this is a bit of a compromise, but I think it works. I mixed a bit of muted pink into the red ecstasy to create one last shade and applied that to the symbol. To bring back some more contrast and color diversity on the energy parts, I did highlight thin lines with Arial yellow, which sort of looks like some of the energy parts being hotter or more intense. On the energy couplings on the wings, I decided to create a bit more variety and to make the lower energy beams darker than the upper ones. So I continued to add layers of fluid paint to these parts and eventually also a mix of the fluid paint and the purple ink. I also added some purple to the transitional parts of the energy and metal parts on the spear. But before we continue, I'm happy that Skillshare sponsored one more video, because that means that you guys enjoyed the offer, clicked on the links, watched a ton of videos, and hopefully learned a lot of new useful skills in the process. For those of you that don't know Skillshare yet, it's an online learning platform that offers classes on just about everything. And I've been asked which of the classes I feel like help with the miniature painting hobby, and my answer to that is just about every class about picture taking, both with your mobile phone and DSLR cameras. All the design classes I watched were helpful, and just about every illustration class, especially the ones by Jazza, gave me new ideas and both new practical and theoretical input. But it doesn't stop at that. You can find precise and concise classes on programs and apps you want to get into, new creative hobbies to pick up, and just about every soft skill you can think of. So I'm happy that once again I can offer a free trial of Skillshare Premium to the first 1000 people that click the link in the description below. And yes, that means access to full premium with no skills attached, and the most important part, you're also supporting this channel in the process. Why not give it a try? For the Necron stone parts, I mixed Vallejo's Emerald with Dark Angel's contrast paint and a bit of Black Templar contrast paint. This resulted in a semi-transparent turquoise. I gave all these parts an initial layer that was still letting some of the black shine through. For the subsequent highlights, I mixed in more and more emerald and just continued to create a gradient over the whole length of the stone, and also added edge highlights for some increased readability, and I left the cracks black. For the next highlights, I started to add ice yellow and added some texture as well as more intense edge highlights. I gave the stones on the ground the same base color, and for the sake of making the glow effect a bit simpler, I started with orange fluor paint right away, instead of using yellow and then red fluor. Whenever I had too much spill, I cleaned it up with the base color green again, and then highlighted the same way I highlighted the stones on the wings and the headgear. To make the stones a bit more interesting, I decided to highlight bright edges next to dark areas to increase the contrast, and I made sure all edges were highlighted in general. I painted the earth with English uniform and shaded it with a mix of dried bark and burnt umber. I also added a thin layer of that mix to the stones to make them feel more connected to the ground and the soil. I wanted to separate the Catan from the Necron parts, like the tail on the back and the little scarabs, so after an initial layer of dark aluminium, I added white to the recesses of the scarabs to set up a glow effect, and then had to clean up a lot of it again with the metal color, because I went too fast. Then I applied a layer of green fluo paint, and after that added one layer of darker green, also around the scarabs, to create a little OSL effect on their surrounding. Again, wherever I touched too much of the metal parts, I did a little cleanup again. It's a small detail, but I think the effect looks very cool. Here's a close-up, judge for yourself. To finish out the metal parts, I used white aluminium for edge highlights. Like I said, I wanted the device on the Void Dragon's back that controls him to look like a different part of tech, and used my method of Rayclan flash shade over dark aluminium that you can see in more detail in this video. This time I used the airbrush to apply the layers of flash shade to speed things up. I still think this looks a lot better than the official brass color Games Workshop is using on their Necrons. To add more variety, I used burnt umber and burnt sienna ink and shaded the device in a more controlled way in some areas. For the detailing, I used white aluminium again and focused on the edges and tried to bring out some of the more exposed parts with the brighter metal color again. After I defined most of the edges on that spine tail thing, I added the last part of the mini to the back of the Void Dragon. To create the color of the tail blades, I went again for a base coat of ice yellow mixed with a little Uriel yellow. Again, if you want to see a few more in-depth videos on my Necrons, you can check out my Patreon, which has about 150 additional exclusive videos. And if you like this and my other free videos here on YouTube, any support on Patreon is appreciated. Or you can get one of my PDF guides through the store on my website. Links are in the description, as always. I gradually added shade layers of green fluo, a mix of green fluo and grass green, and in the end I added a bit of incubate darkness to the mix to create the darkest layers. And this is the result. I decided to go for a quicker scheme, mostly using washes on top of base layers, and I think you will be able to replicate most of these effects if you want to. If you need help with anything, the $1 and $2 pledges on Patreon allow you access to my Discord, where you can ask for help with your projects. Don't forget to hit the follow button if you enjoyed the video, and if you want to do me a favor, please follow my Instagram. I'm about 900 followers away from 10,000. Thanks for watching, stay creative, and I'll see you in the next video.